The Inspire Us podcast.
No, I think it's a real, and I actually think it's a real belonging problem in this country, honestly.
Yeah. No, I think it
People think
is.
about it.
It is funny. Usually I just say I'm French, but then people ask me, oh, but like, where else, right?
That's the thing everyone always asks you.
But-
Okay, where are you really?
Yeah.
I hate that question, depending on where it comes from and with what intent, right? Sometimes I can tell that other immigrants are just curious. But sometimes I can sense that what they mean is you can't be from here because you don't look like us. And obviously I can't be from here because I, don't sound like you guys either.
Yeah.
But I find it more, I think, irritating when I hear it done to other people who do sound British, who are from here, have been here all their lives, and they get asked that question. And then I'm irritated.
Yeah.
Then I just I have this, we tend not to do that in Canada. And I think even in the US, you don't tend to say things like, where are you really from?
Yeah.
Because this is what my my other North American friend said. She goes, in North America, as long as you're born there, you are as American as anyone else there.
Exactly.
Whereas in Europe, perhaps because of the history, I don't know, you just, even if you're a migrant, second, third generation, you still feel like there's this distance or gap between you being truly British.
Yes.
But regardless of how steeped you are in British culture.
And that bothers me so much.
It's a shame. And I think for me, it was a big part of my upbringing, being very British, but just not being British enough, even though it's all you know.
I know what you mean. And that was, I thought about that for a long time as a Canadian growing up. But as I grew older, I've always felt very innately Canadian. And then I come here and I see the differences in identity and what it means to be a second generation immigrant here versus what it felt like in Canada. And I think the difference, I would say, is down to how you feel about belonging. I feel like I belong in Canada, and I don't always feel that with my the second generation equivalents here. That if people were born in this country, I feel like they almost have a right to belong, that they should feel like they are as much this country as anyone else. And that's just not how people feel.
There's a real conversation, I think, about blood. Where's your blood from? And I was thinking about this, like, does it matter? Maybe it does matter. I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter. I think you do have a point saying, I feel like Canada especially is just very, united in that sense. Like, you're Canadian first. While America still has, like, race in America is still this kind of, niche thing. Like, with slavery, it's all messed up there. It's very different to here, I feel like, racism.
But sorry to interrupt you there, Alex. Do you think it stems from the history and the fact that the indigenous Americans, they're a minority. So the vast majority of the population, they can't really trace their ancestry back from a time which predates the indigenous Americans. Whereas in Europe, there's still, a lot of people here. The vast majority of Europeans, they can trace their identities back from for a very long time. They're more rooted in their sense of where they belong. Whereas America is very new, Canada is new. So perhaps that plays into it as well.
Absolutely it does. It's an immigrant culture.
Exactly. But I think, as you said, it's all about this sense of belonging and where you see home. And being British, when I go back to Nigeria, there is a sense of home because I am Nigerian. I grew up hearing Nigerian languages, eating Nigerian food. But when I'm here, that is the most sense of home I will ever get in the world. And it's a shame that it's contested. Like, my very visceral feeling of home is sort of denied and rejected sometimes. So yeah, I guess it's a tricky thing.
It is. It's one of my favorite questions to ask people, in terms of understanding who they are and how they think about the world. Where do you call home? Yeah, it's always very interesting.
Yeah.
The answers that come out as a result of that. But that's partly why I get to this, the kinds of things that we're talking about. And you can see how if people look different than the rest of whatever their home country looks like, the answers that come out are often very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel that sense of home here?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. No, not in the same way.
Mm.
I think but I think that's a very normal experience for an immigrant to have. Not to say that I don't have a lot of friends, but culturally, you don't share the same in-jokes, right? So I don't understand when people make references to things that happened in, the 1980s or the 1990s, or just kind of very classic British references to, I don't know, whatever it is, characters, figures. And I have that same set of references for North America, but I just don't have it for here in the same way. But part of it too, I think, is just how you find community. So I would say lately I've found some of it, but that has come out of just actually, believe it or not, playing paddle. That's why I was talking to you guys about this, that playing paddle has made a big difference in terms of getting to know people locally. So I found it in different ways through the academic community, but that's pretty much uniform around the world. So you can find an academic community no matter where you go. And people in academia are always generally very open to other people from different cultures. And then I found outside of that, some of the political party work that I've been doing has, I think, given me an entree into British society in a really interesting way. So I really feel like I have true friends there as well. But locally, I'd found it quite tough until more recently. So yeah, I think different ways. You can find that community in different ways, but also depends on what stage of life you're in.
True.
You guys will find it much more easily than I will because I'm so much older, and you have many more opportunities to interact, and you're going out with lots of people. So as you get older, it just becomes more difficult.
I guess because as you get older, you're more rooted in who you are. These things are more embedded, or you don't think so?
No, I don't think it's that. I mean, it could be that as well. But I think the stronger factor that correlates with what you're saying about your beliefs and your sense of self is also just that you have less time to spend in depth with meeting lots of new people, right? So I meet tons of students. I meet lots of new people all the time, but many of them are transient. So, they're coming and they're going, right? So for you guys, if you stay in one place, you're socializing together at a time when you have a lot of spare time to socialize with each other. When you have kids, then it becomes more difficult, right? So a lot of your life is then spent at work and with the same people, and also, dealing with your family life.
Yeah.
So then your world changes. Whereas you guys, you're at the best stage, which is openness to everything, meeting tons of people, being excited about everything, and having a lot of your spare time engaging socially. So, I'm jealous, honestly. I'm jealous.
We try to make the most of it. I always tell Dara, once we'll be like 40, 50 and have the success we think we want, we'll give it all away to be back right here, this young stage of trying to, go on an adventure and all this. So we'll try to take it. It's hard, even though we tell ourselves to take it in, we probably won't, but we'll try our best, But
sorry, I just realized we haven't properly. Do I need to introduce myself or something?
I mean, sure, if you want. I mean,
I feel like we skipped through the other bits.
No, because we usually don't. Because I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I guess we can slide into your area of expertise. Even we were kind of talking about not feeling home and tensions in society when you come from a different place. But even it gets complicated when we think about conflict, because then you look at Pakistan and India, they look exactly the same. Big conflict that doesn't get resolved. So maybe I can ask you this to help maybe introduce your field of work, which is looking at conflict and how can we transition to peace. And that's kind of a complicated thing to look at. What are some of the things that involve, making peace or de-escalating tensions?
Yeah, I mean, if I could come up with a simple answer
Right, a
for you,
formula.
exactly, I wish I could bottle that and sell it to the world and make the world a better place. I don't think I wish it was as simple as a formula. I think there are a million things that go into it. I think you have to think about a country's history. I think you have to think about how different groups in society interact with one another. I think you have to think about the current information environment, because these days it's quite different than what it was like even 10 years ago, certainly 20 or 30 years ago before social media. And even when you've managed to, say, de-escalate things, you can have things really fired up and charged up just with a post or two, right? That can change all of the dynamics in a moment. That just didn't used to be the case. Things didn't go viral as quickly. So, I mean, some of the fundamentals, because we were talking about things like home, right? This idea of home, I would say, for me, I think about the places that work and the places that don't work as well, and the places where I've seen conflict erupt and why. And one way that I now think about it is certainly through the lens of social cohesion, and how social cohesion happens, how people think about their identity. So this is going back to the conversation we were having earlier, right? So in the places where you see conflict persisting, that sense of identity is just so important that sometimes people are willing to die for it. They feel a sense of injustice. They feel that they've been wronged, and they have been wronged in a lot of cases, right? But chances are they've also wronged the other side, right? So it's rarely ever as simple as, one side doing everything to the other side without something happening back. But I mean, if you're thinking about how you bring societies from a situation of conflict and into peace, you've got all sorts of other tools that we can use nowadays. I think some of those tools are actually being dismantled. We think about things like peacekeeping. We think about, on occasion, military intervention to stop the worst things from happening. Very occasionally that works. Often it backfires terribly. Or one side is saying that they're doing this in order to justify something. And in fact, it's actually a mask for something else that's going on. Having said that, I think of what happened in Kosovo, where there was a case to be made for humanitarian intervention to end, the ethnic cleansing of another population. More often than not, it doesn't work out as well and as cleanly as that. But how do you do this in non-military ways? Classically, we've used things like sanctions if you're coming from the outside. So if you think about what external groups are doing, you can apply all sorts of diplomatic pressure. You can apply financial pressure. You can apply economic pressure. You can see all of the ways in which pressure is being applied just by watching President Trump right now, right? Like there are lots of different tools that you can use if you want to choose to use them. Sometimes using them comes with other types of consequences for both, your financial sector, your economic sector, or your military sector and your other relationships. But there are tools out there. So if you put these boxes into, what you can do into, here in the UK, what we can do as the UK or as part of some other coalition of actors, either through the UN, through NATO, with the EU, and previously through the EU, there are things that you can do from the outside. And then there are things that you can do regionally with regional actors, right? So if you support them quietly, which is, I think, one of the great strengths that the UK used to have previously, is to really do a lot of that behind the scenes work. excellent diplomatic relations with so many different countries around the world, doing a lot of quiet diplomatic work.
Seems very British.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And nobody ever said anything about these things, right? So I think classically really about the European Union as the classic way in which the EU did this kind of work. But then, you have to think about internally within the country itself and obviously with the country that it's in conflict with. And there are all sorts of things that internally just, we can't, the country itself could do. Better governance, recognizing minorities and inclusion of those minorities a lot of the time, not targeting, say, political opposition for speaking up, opening up the media, really giving more voices to civil society. And that sounds a little bit idealistic these days, but sometimes it's as simple as, just making some basic things work better so that people see recognizable improvements in their lives. So, a whole range of things, right? And I would just think about them in those buckets of what goes on inside the country, what goes on regionally, and then what goes on outside and multilaterally. And you can use all these different forms of things depending on how much money you have, how much power you have, how much influence you have, how much you care about this particular situation to bring different combinations of those things to bear at different points in time during a conflict or even afterwards.
Okay. And in the mission of peacekeeping, do you think being immersed or steeped in the history is overstated? Because I remember listening to Tony Blair and him talking about, the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I think one of the first things he had obviously done was to read and read and read about the history. But ultimately, do you think that can actually impact you negatively because you might get too into the details and the tit for tat instead of focusing on, hey, there's two sides of the story and they don't agree, and how do we get them in a room together to agree to peace? So do you think history is perhaps overstated? What do you see it, what role do you see it having? And do you think perhaps it's just all about getting people together in a room and tit for tats, the historical details aren't so important?
I think that the history of a place cannot be overstated. The importance of history in understanding conflict and how to resolve conflict, you can never know too much, right? So I think the more you understand the details of those places and those conflicts, the better able you are to understand why somebody might see that conflict very differently from you. And I would say the thing that's lacking there, though, is the ability to empathize with the other side, right? So when you're talking about this inability to sit in somebody else's shoes and think, what does that exact same event look like from their perspective? And why are they doing it? How are they justifying this? That's the thing that is missing, right? So if you absorb only one side of a history, so, in the UK's case with Northern Ireland, if you are only taking in the British story about what's going on here, and in particular, the Protestant story about this, and you are missing out on how, the IRA feels about it, about how Sinn Féin might feel about it, about how the Catholics have been treated over time, about how the Irish feel about it, right? So if you can't move from one side to the other and really deeply empathize with what each side has experienced, then you're in trouble, right? Because if you only take in your side of history, you really fail to appreciate why somebody else is doing all these other things. But if you don't know about the history, then you're really in trouble. You shouldn't be at the table. Yeah.
I think people were surprised by that, and this reminds me of Tucker Carlson when he went to interview Putin on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And right from the start, Putin straight goes to 1200, year 1200, talks about the early starts of, the empire and the historical roots and religious roots and just started. And then I think people were getting frustrated. It's like, no, don't, you're telling me about all this, or it's a nonsense we want to know about right now. But he's saying, no, hold on. There's a whole story to this. And I think you make a really good point in saying that in conflict, knowing the history allows us to empathize with the other side. Because if we're going to resolve conflict, we need to also understand their perspective in order to find a solution. I feel like if we're always, in our bubble, there's no way for us to kind of, translate to reach them to get on the same side. I don't know. History seems important.
Absolutely. I think sometimes what happens is people are so wrapped up in their side of the bad things that have been done to them that they are still so overcome with trauma, right? If they're experiencing it in real time, that they don't have space for somebody else's trauma. I think that's completely understandable, right? And that is to me, that's okay. But that's not what the role of people who are outside of that conflict should play, right? So if you're coming from the outside and you're trying to help mediate, or you're trying to support the two sides to come together, it is your job then to help and kind of overcome that inability for each side to empathize with the other. I have the most admiration for people who have gone through and watched their friends and relatives being killed or murdered or done whatever to, and they are still able to forgive, right? That to me is just tremendous. But I'm not sure that most of us can do this, right? So I don't expect that. But I also think that if somebody doesn't help you understand that that gap, you need to find a way to bridge that gap in order to be able to move on. And sometimes that just means accepting, right? Accepting that the other side either has done these things, and then you go forward. And so I think this is also something that's very interesting about how the West thinks about how you deal with, say, reconciliation and empathy, that you need to be able to understand deeply the other side, or maybe, to accept, right? And sometimes that's not what societies want. Sometimes they literally want to draw a line under it and move on, that it's too much to process. I think our cultural systems find that difficult. And so I would just, I would put some of these caveats in there. But it made me think about what you were saying about the Tucker Carlson Putin interview. And I don't think this is going to make me very popular, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is that I think we have an inability to understand where Putin is coming from. That is not to say that it justifies the invasion of Ukraine. Nothing justifies the invasion of another country these days. We are, this is not 200 years ago, right? So this is not how things are done. But having said that, if you want to tell the story of Putin, then he just sees what's going on in a very, very different way. He sees that he was once, in his lifetime, and you guys are too young to remember this, but, as somebody who saw the fall of the Berlin Wall in my teens, the USSR was one of the two big superpowers in the world. And to watch that turn into, the Russia of today is, I think, deeply humiliating for both, Putin himself, but also for the entire country, right? And he just never felt that Russia got the respect that it deserved, especially after the West, after the United States won the Cold War. There were certain agreements that he felt had been infringed upon, and people can argue about what that should look like, but frankly, it almost doesn't matter, because he feels like, and really this matters, right? It's how he feels about this situation, that those agreements have been violated, and that there would be this buffer zone, and or
the not 1 inch.
And yes, exactly. So he, for us, we look at the EU and NATO as being two completely separate entities. And he just looks at it as being the West. He sees those two as one and the same. We don't feel that is true, right? So when there was the possibility of accession for Ukraine into the EU, he flipped out. And if you're thinking about it from the Russian perspective and he doesn't trust the West, then he thinks it looks like something quite different. And it doesn't look like that from the rest of the other NATO allies, right? So these are the differences, I would say. Like some of these differences seems relatively subtle to him, there are no differences. And for us, they seem like, why would you think that the EU and NATO are different and aren't different entities when to us they so clearly are, right? So this is what I mean by that shift in perspective. If you don't trust the West, then how can you trust this, right? And when you're us, if you're coming from the West, you're like, these are completely different entities. This is not what we're proposing. We do not want to invade Russia.
But I think you make a really good point to say, well, we're not justifying it, but it's obvious, at least to me, that we clearly here in the West, maybe we don't want to see it, but we clearly don't understand Russia's perspective. We still don't know. Like, if you ask anyone here, based on the narrative that we understand, we don't understand Russia's side of things. And that's a problem when we thinking about solutions, I believe. And if we're going to start thinking about, well, we need to, get Putin and Zelensky to come to an agreement, if we're going to be part of that solution, we need to understand at least they need to feel like we understand what their point of view is. There's this, I think it was Jordan Peterson, this like a psychiatrist who was talking about how to resolve, a one-to-one argument. And he said there's this great technique where before you say anything, you have to repeat what you think they say and ask them, is this what you mean? And you have to try again until they say yes. And that's a really effective way. Like once they feel like, yes, that is a good representation of how I feel, that is like a magical unlock moment to allow for peace and to happen. And with Russia, it's clearly a conflict where that's really not happening.
That's a technique I use with my son.
Oh.
He's a teenager. No, but I think that's right. Part of it is that if you can verbalize what you think the other side is thinking, I think that's a helpful way to start, right? So when I was talking about inclusion, part of that and why identity is so important, part of what you are trying to do in a conversation that often has to deal with deep trauma is to recognize what the other side has been through. And for some people, that other side starts 50 years ago. And for other people, that other side of the story starts 100 years ago, right? So you will start your narrative at a different point. And the other side will see that some events are incredibly important and others will see that those same events were not as important, right? Or they just really characterize them differently, right? So we can think about the Nakba in some cases with Israel-Palestine, which, this is not how the Israelis talk about that moment, right? Or I'm thinking about in Liberia's case, there is a day of what's considered, it's their National Independence Day, but it was also the time that the native groups in Liberia were, overtaken and fought a really horrible war at the beginning of what was considered to be the founding of the country, right? And the two groups, right? So one, even though they were a group of freed slaves, about 130 of them coming over from the U.S., and then they landed on the shores, and then they effectively took over a chunk of land by force, right? But in order to get to the point where they were allowed to settle on that land and keep that land, they had to actually come together, prepare for war, and fought all of these other tribes that were around them. For the tribes around them who were native to those areas, horrible day, right? This is not a day that you want to celebrate as part of being Liberian necessarily, if you think back to the history. But for the groups that had come over, who, they called themselves the America Liberians, for them, it was a huge victory, right? So that same Independence Day has very divisive connotations. And nobody thinks about, how the society today, well, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people think about this, but, how it ended up the way that it has, with all of the conflicts that it has been through, in part, like, you think back to the history and how those relationships developed, and you think there is a trajectory here that leads you to this place.
Question on the Liberian Civil War stuff. So were the Americo Liberians, is that what it was? Were they like black people from America that they sent back to Liberia? Am I correct in saying that, on some like deal where they wanted to bring back, black people to Africa, and then they kind of took power, and then I don't really know what happened. But I just find it interesting that they came in and had this power, and then also had this sort of, what would you call it, discriminate. I don't know much
Yes.
about, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know much about what happened in Liberia, but it's interesting, right? The human mind placed under certain situations. We think, you would think that, coming from, North America, I say, all right, no, we come from slavery, this, but then placing under a certain situation, power feeds, and the human mind is very rough. I mean, some people will say we've been at war forever, so.
Yeah. But you wrote a book as well called Extrajudicial Groups in Post-Conflict Liberia. But how would you distinguish between an extrajudicial group and a terrorist group?
So yes to most of what you've just said, Alex. And so, but I'll answer the other question first, just to make it a little bit more clear. So the book is looking at what I call extralegal groups, and these were groups that typically took over some kind of natural resource area, and then this is after the war, right? But they're not groups that were ideological, right? So I would think about terrorist groups mostly as having some kind of political objective. And these were more like armed groups with a business objective. They were just trying to, make a living, right? In other places, in Italy, for example, we would probably call them something more like mafia groups, right? But they were nowhere near as organized as that.
Okay.
And so they would come together in various formations, mostly made up of the bits and pieces of different armed groups. But sometimes you would get people from different armed groups coming together that previously fought each other, right? So it just didn't make a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways after war that you would, I think, first of all, see that there would be all of this interesting activity in a place that was quote unquote peaceful, right? So if you looked at it by the numbers, Liberia looked like a very peaceful place after the war. But in fact, there was all this interesting activity going on beneath the surface. And you just kind of scraped the surface and you could see how unstable society was. I don't think it's that way anymore. But there was a period where on paper, it was peaceful, but it felt like the country could erupt back into conflict at any given moment, right? So, I asked people when that period ended. So I was there in 2005 and then again in 2007.
So in Liberia?
In Liberia, yeah. Wow. And I definitely felt it in both of those periods. Certainly in 2005, it just felt like things could blow up at any given moment. This is 2 years after a formal peace agreement had been reached. And then in 2007, you could absolutely still feel it. And I asked people, who lived there, when did that feeling go away? And they knew exactly what I was talking about, right? And they said about, I don't know, maybe like 10 years, it took at least 10 years, right? So somewhere between they varied, but somewhere between like 2014 to 2015, sometime in that zone, like in the early to mid 2010s. So it took a long time, is the point, for this kind of unsettled feeling where things could felt like they would still erupt
Mm.
when that feeling went away. And just to say something about the version of what you were saying about the freed slaves coming over, that is actually mostly right, but they were not being repatriated back to where their ancestors who had been slaves had necessarily come from. And some number of them had been taken from West Africa. So that was absolutely part of the idea. But some of them had been taken from the Congo. And so the weird thing is they ended up calling them Congos, right? So it was a whole thing happened in Liberia where they took those freed slaves, and there was a whole political project behind that too, right? Part of it was just to get rid of freed slaves from the U.S. because they didn't want those people stirring up trouble, providing role models for others in some cases. So they thought it was a convenient way and also a political project that some of those freed slaves wanted to participate in. So that was very, very interesting. But then what happened, exactly as you said, Alex, was that when they arrived, they ended up replicating the order, except this time they were the masters and not the slaves, right? So that I just found to be also, just like you said, just so wrong, right?
But doesn't that reveal that we're so tribal? Like, we're so tribal in the sense that, maybe they came, maybe, yeah, we might be the same color, but we don't have the same culture. We're coming from North America. We speak the same language. And then so we have our own tribe, and we kind of, scare away, and we find our community, and we stay within that community. And we have this human side of us that it's always us against them. And it's hard to get away from that.
I think you have to set up institutions that are deliberately trying to overcome that. And I think it has to be done consciously if you really are trying to do that. But that is exactly what happened, right? They did become their own tribe, right? And over time, they did become yet another tribe. And interestingly enough, they ended up absorbing people who were taken as slaves from the Congo and actually who had been freed slaves themselves. And then those people actually ended up being integrated into the households of the Americo-Liberians. And these people really were from the Congo. So over a period of time, that whole, the Americo-Liberians became the Congos, and I say that in air quotes. But that population then grew. And so these people worked in the households of those people and were sort of, but not quite seen as family. But because they were raised in the same environment, they were part of the same class and part of that same tribe over time. So it was very interesting how all of that happened. But at the same time, everything that you said was also true, right? That they ended up replicating such an order that was just huge. I mean, discriminatory is a nice way to put it.
But so how did they even get into power? I mean, they're coming from I imagine they're a minority. They're coming from a different continent, not just a different country. How did they get in and get into power? And is that why there was a civil war? Because that led to a lot of inequality and discrimination in the society. Is that what happened?
Yes. I mean, there was a lot of inequality. There was a lot of discrimination. And how they came into power, I think, is also just really, really interesting. I mean, they were traders that stayed along the coast, right? So usually the tribes would be inland, the native tribes, the people who were actually from Liberia originally. And they did a lot of the trading, and I think they just became more prosperous over time. And then they started building out institutions, and over time they just grew those institutions and took over those areas. And they basically ended up ruling from the coast, but claimed the territory over the inland areas. And then when they were able to do that, there's a whole complicated story here, but all that to say that the borders were contested. The French really wanted to because they had neighboring Côte d'Ivoire. And then the British wanted the other bits because they were coming from Sierra Leone next door, right? And so, basically from the and the French were also in the north where Guinea is, right? So they were on all sides. These poor Americo settlers and also the native people, I think, were maybe less invested in this, but they wanted to maintain the borders of Liberia and wanted to create something of a state. And by that point, they sort of had, they had a relationship with America, and it was sort of like the stepchild of the U.S., but not a direct colonial outpost, right? So it was something in between. And so they had the support there, sort of, but not quite. And in order to be able to keep those borders, though, they would have to find a way to police them. And so in the process of doing so, they decided to adopt the Barclay Plan, which is basically indirect rule.
Okay.
And that's how they ended up doing this. So they followed the British model, and they co-opted the chiefs, the key people from the inside, essentially paid them, bribes and whatever, and gave them power to administer. And then at the same time, created something of a military force that allowed them to maintain order there and also guard the borders. And so in that way, they started building those institutions. And some of those institutions just became really brutal over time. Really brutal.
So did this have any spillover effects in the neighboring countries? A bit similar to perhaps Rwanda and Congo through their conflict. Did this sort of seep into other nations, or was it very contained? As people become displaced and there's conflict, you flee somewhere else and you try to claim other land, or, so did this have that effect?
So we'll fast forward now. So the bit that I was talking about before was quite historical. If we fast forward into the period of the Civil War, then absolutely you had tons of displacement, right? So Liberia was a country of 3 million people, and 1 million of those people were displaced, sometimes multiple times, right? So, and they went all over into Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, into Guinea. They, depending on whatever the closest border was, they fled. And often, many of them were internally displaced as well. If something was happening in a particular place, then they would flee, wherever it was they could go. So it wasn't always across a border when you get termed a refugee. Sometimes it was internal, and then, you end up becoming a migrant, right? So, an internally displaced person. So there was all sorts of displacement happening, and it became problematic in part because then you have armed groups setting up on the border of Liberia, right? So depending on how you feel about whoever's in charge at the time, then that conflict totally spread from Liberia. Totally spread from and Charles Taylor, for much of this, was at the heart of a lot of this, and was trained by by Gaddafi actually, and was there with people like Foday Sankoh during the period when they had the camps going on, when Gaddafi was running these camps, right? So it was trying to spur revolution, and to a large part succeeded.
Wow. Yeah, I think your experience as well, when you mentioned briefly about there being a feeling as to when the conflict changed, or to when people sort of were able to have amicable relationships with one another. I think perhaps it goes amiss sometimes when talking about peacekeeping, because you can sign a paper and the leaders can agree, but what about the people? What about the other organizations? Has peace truly been achieved? These people have had family members die. That resentment doesn't just go away once a paper is signed.
And on that point, when we're talking about Russia and we're talking about things like humiliation and, talking about identity and stuff like this, I feel like that's part of it too. Like, you can sign a peace deal, but as a leader, especially like the Russia conflict, that both sides have lost so many men. It's like now it becomes that much harder to find a solution because both sides have already dedicated and lost resources. So now it's like, yeah, we can come to a deal, but we need to come to a deal where both sides aren't seen as, or their population doesn't look at them as, you're not a strong leader, you humiliated us. It becomes quite difficult.
And in peacekeeping also, is there things in place after to ensure that this happens? I think in Rwanda, Kagame implemented some schemes where he would have Tutsi and Hutu come together and collaborate and talk about the history. So there's not resentment built up. These things are addressed. I think they'd watch documentaries of the war together to sort of create this unity. So when we do peacekeeping attempts, is that something that is incorporated? Like it goes beyond just the paper that's signed on that day?
So lots of questions there. The answer to what gets incorporated into what's considered to be a peace operation, right, depends on the extent to which resources are allocated to that and the type of mission that it is, right? So some of these missions have a peace building component to it, and some of them were previously really much grander schemes, right? So there would be all sorts of different parts to what would be considered to be a peace operation. So you would have, say, for example, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of people who were fighting, right? So typically these would be from the armed groups, but sometimes, like in the case of Liberia, everybody who fought, including the military itself, everybody was disarmed and had to hand in a weapon, and then you reconstitute your forces from scratch, right? In other cases, the military stays the military, and then you have to decide to what extent you want to integrate the people who were in the armed groups. Sometimes they don't get integrated at all. Sometimes they do. So that would be, for example, one component along with the reform of the security sector that would follow that. Other times you have human rights programs that go along with it. You might have quite a lot of development work that's done with it. You might have a rule of law reform that goes with it, corruption, all these kind of good governance activities. And you have a lot of typically humanitarian aid that comes in and NGOs that help provide some of the structure to this as you're trying to help a state build capacity, right? And to the extent that there is enough funding, right, then a lot of this could be done by the United Nations or some other, set of regional actors who want to support this. Sometimes it's, these people do this and then this institution does that, and everybody kind of spreads out the work. Those are not common anymore, right? Those were basically the things that happened through the 1990s and the 2000s, early 2000s. The peacekeeping has basically,
So
I wouldn't quite say disappeared, but it's very, very rare. And if you just look, which I think is deeply sad, that the UN itself has lost its presence on the international stage when it comes to dealing with war to peace transitions, peacekeeping, peacemaking, mediation.
So would you say that we're in a crisis of peacekeeping?
We're definitely in a crisis of peacekeeping if you think about anybody who does peacekeeping. There just isn't very much happening on that front. If you think about it, again, depending on who you are in this system and what you want to achieve, if you feel like it's a might makes right world and you want to be able to, control what happens within your own borders and let everybody else, come what may, then, if you're Donald Trump, maybe you just don't care, right? So depends on who you are in this system and what you value and what you think should be happening. Others might just say, we shouldn't get involved in this.
So where do you sit? Because I feel like there's been this pendulum swing constantly with this discussion around, shall we get involved or shall we just stay out of it? I think in the 90s you had the Yugoslav wars in Somalia, and at the time people were shocked that, all right, in the Yugoslav wars, the intervention was too slow. In Somalia, they didn't intervene. Then we had Iraq and Afghanistan, and this was this very, very heavy-handed way of dealing with these conflicts, these crises. And now we're back to, all right, it's better to not get involved, I think you've worked with DFID in the past, and we've seen that be dissolved. And I think Starmer's government, they've now cut development, and so we're slowly seeing this reversal, this pulling away of the global north from the global south and from these conflicts. And how can you how do we get back to being a bit more pragmatic, a bit more realistic about some of these issues, and that it's not quite good enough to just say it's not my problem. These things are going to have second and third order effects. So where do you stand on this debate very broadly, and what can we do to sort of get the conversation back to acknowledging both sides and finding a happy medium almost?
So I personally have just had huge swings in, my own understandings and thinking about all of this stuff. And partly, I am creature of the period in which I grew up, right? So I was born in 1975. I'm 50 right now, but it does mean that I saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? And I saw 9/11 when I was in my 20s. And in fact, I was staring at the World Trade Center the night before it was attacked.
Wow.
Yeah, and my husband was working at the World Trade Center on the day it was attacked, right? So I have very
Wow.
visceral
Wow.
Wait, so
memories.
he was there?
Yeah, he was there. He was there. He worked on Wall
Insane.
Street. So I also happened to be studying at Princeton at the time, and I had just done an American foreign policy class, and I knew right away that it was Osama bin Laden. Like
Wow.
we knew, like on the morning of it happened, and
It's
I was
him.
having a discussion, yes, with my roommates, and we
Mm.
all agreed it was Osama
Yeah.
bin Laden. It was another attempt. But all that to say that I also protested the Iraq War. It was probably the first major political demonstration that I ever participated in, because I had really studied and tried to look for those connections and did not see any,
Mm.
right? So I was doing a human rights law class at the time, and we really did look for the evidence, and I knew where things were going in that conversation, and you could see it building up basically immediately after 9/11. And I couldn't believe that they would be able to pull it off.
Mm.
But they did in justifying the invasion, right? And now to these days, I work on Iraq too. So I see this as kind of coming full circle. And when you're asking me about, hey, what is my understanding of the world? I think once upon a time in the 1990s, in that very kind of glorious golden age of, hey, we are the West has won the Cold War. Our version and understanding of how the world could work, it seemed very idealistic, and everything seemed possible, right? So in that moment where there was an agreed ideology of how things should be run, and I would say, this is the quote unquote international rules-based order, right? With you, and you could see those institutions developing with the International Criminal Court, with things being decided at the UN having much more flexibility. You could see the rise of NGOs actually coming to have voice, which they didn't have, right? So I don't think any of you guys, you can't recognize that change, but because you don't remember a time when NGOs weren't powerful. But when I was growing up, they had no voice,
Oh,
right? Like
wow.
they weren't really a voice on the global stage in the same way that they became after the end of the Cold War, right? So you started having all of these interesting innovations around how the world dealt with peace and conflict issues. There were very, very few peacekeeping missions during the Cold War, right? And all of a sudden there was an explosion of them. And all of a sudden there were things like, truth and reconciliation commissions, which I think people in this field take for granted now. The first one was in, at least one of the first ones was in Peru. And then the big one that people started talking about was the one from South Africa. And then after that, the field grew, right? But these things were very, very, very rare, right? And you just saw this whole change of economic regimes changing. You saw all of the different kind of multilateral actors taking a role. And then you saw that change over time too, and honestly, become more cynical about it after the invasion of Iraq. That I think took a took a very different kind of turn and changed how people felt about what was going on in the system. And that, I think, too, was the beginning of the, hey, is this such a good idea? Are we, why are we doing this again? Because it doesn't look like it was what we intended originally to do, right? And I mean, there's a whole story around that too, but that's just to say that I think over time, you asked me how I feel about these things. It's because I think about it now on a very, very specific case-to-case basis, thinking about the history, who is doing the intervention, what does that look like, what exactly are the motivations that are going on here? Like, I think much more deeply about the context and the what exactly I think is going on here before I would say yes, good, no, bad, right?
But how would you make the case to someone who's very vehemently against the UK going into these countries and intervening or providing support? How do you make
But I
that
think
case
it's
that this is
not
important?
necessarily a black or white issue. I think what you say is really important, that each conflict is different and each conflict requires an in-depth assessment of whether or not intervention is necessary. Or, well, not necessary, because what does necessary mean, right? Then we start asking those questions. But it's like, and that will change based on each country. Maybe there's a conflict that's happening that the UK should get involved, but America shouldn't, you know? And then we talk about alliances. Well, hey, this is my problem. You're my ally. You should help too. Right? That was what happened when France tried to, call on NATO after the Bataclan attacks. But it didn't happen. But it is like, it shouldn't be a black or white thing. Even like now that everyone's like hands off, it shouldn't be like that. And even like Trump, it feels like although he is having this hands off issue, look, he just, with this Armenia Azerbaijan thing that happened like last week, like they're still trying to make deals. But
I'll just interrupt you. I don't think that was my point. My point was actually to counteract those who are very black and white, those in the UK who say no, we shouldn't get involved whatsoever. I'm advocating for a more nuanced view, because clearly, to some degree, you do have to get involved. So I was just wondering, like, how would you make that case that, you can't just have this very black and white approach of saying these issues around the world are not our problems? And I'm an advocate for, intervention when it's, when people or organizations deem it's necessary. But I struggle at times to make that case to someone who's very, very against any sort of intervention, especially in the context of the cost of living crisis, and people feel so like disenfranchised and disillusioned with the current state of the country. So how do you make that case to divert more public resources to these conflicts? It's very hard.
So I think part of this really hinges on how you think about what intervention is and what it consists of, right? So I suspect that people in the UK would be perfectly fine and would advocate for the UK, quote unquote, getting involved if it were to mean, having diplomats kind of try and ease the way and help bring the two sides together, and doing a lot of the basic work of just helping the two sides understand each other, right? So, things like that, I don't think are terribly, for the most part, not terribly controversial, right? I also suspect that most people understand that there are instances where you really do need humanitarian aid. And I think for the most part, that's also relatively uncontroversial, right? So you have a famine going on, you have a natural disaster happening somewhere. People understand that, right? The same is true within the UK, right? There's a flood that happens somewhere, you send resources to help those people. So I think, in that way, I think those kinds of things are not controversial. Where you start talking about things like military intervention, very controversial, right? And I would say that's a kind of whole nother kettle of fish. But there are all these other things that sort of in between, right? So economic sanctions, people think of as being, a relatively costless way of doing this. And sometimes it can be. If you're targeting a direct individual who you think has been implicated in some way. And, I've seen this work in other places, again, like West Africa being a good example of this. If you you would be surprised at how many people send their kids to British boarding schools, right?
Yeah.
Or, Swiss boarding schools, or have their wives love to shop
Yeah.
in a rich country, right? And so sometimes it's quite effective when the target is actually not just the individual themselves, but the people who are related to them, and not, I mean, nothing kind of, harsh or violent. We're talking about things like restricting their access to the country, right? So just not letting them come and visit. So these kinds of things can work, right? Again, I think relatively uncontroversial, but there are all sorts of other things where you start getting into the, okay, military aid, right? Do we give these people weapons or should we stop selling them weapons? In the case of here in the UK, and thinking about Israel, right? So, that's when the should we get involved question, you really have to get into the weeds of what are the two sides? What are they after? What are they doing? What are we supporting? What is our objective here? And then you have to think about your relationships with your allies, with those other governments, with the other side. And the calculation just becomes much more complex now. I think it used to be more straightforward, to the extent that the United States was probably more of a kind of organizer of Western interests. Not always, oftentimes France, for example, would take the lead in Mali, right? So, but in some cases, I think you can justify, right? So I look back to Sierra Leone in the UK. I would find it difficult now in hindsight to say, no, that at that moment when it happened, it was a big, powerful country intervening in a former colonial territory that it wasn't really interested in taking over. Right? This was not a kind of Russia-Ukraine situation, right? The U.S. was not interested in occupying and taking over Sierra Leone. That was very obvious. And the motives looked like they were relatively humanitarian and for the purposes of stabilizing. And also the people on the other side of that looked deeply violent and pretty horrific in what they were doing, right? So in that kind of situation, and also because we know what worked, we can say, actually, that was an intervention that worked out militarily. You can't say that about most of these interventions, right? But I can say that about this one. So if you ask me and say, and put a blanket, no, it never works. Like, I'm not sure that that's the right answer either. But you have to damn well know what the hell you're doing, what you're getting yourself into, and really think about it, right? That was a very powerful military actor going into a very disorganized place and being able to change the landscape and provide stability in a way that I'm not sure that other actors would have been able to.
What do you think the biggest issue is? Because I guess the heavy-handed approach is very wrong. You can't just install, American democracy in the Middle East. But then, I know people talk about, working with the people. It has to come very naturally through civil society. But perhaps this might sound a bit crude, but some people might make the argument perhaps they wouldn't know best how to build a successful state since they haven't done it. So it's quite hard to, to come up with a very clear way of tackling these things. And I wonder, what is the best way? Because I think that's the biggest question right now is, all right, how do we actually intervene when it's necessary? Can we successfully state build? And I just wonder, like, what is the way? Do you have any sort of inkling as to how?
So I think in right now, the way that you're discussing it, you're thinking about state building as being something that is being done from the outside. And if you think about state building that is something that is being done from the inside, right, then that's part of your answer, right? So how do you build capacity? How do you build it so that the institutions last and are indigenous to the place, right? That they belong to the people in a way. And I teach a course on state building and state failure, right? So we spend a lot of time thinking about these things. And I don't have a formula for anybody, but I wouldn't say that there is one best way. I mean, look, we have some models out there for how we have seen, what we would call quote unquote successful states come through the other side of this, right? But if you think about this country, right, the UK, how long have we had rule of law here, right? 800 years, in theory, since the Magna Carta, 800 years, okay? What has that meant in practice for the average person to be able to get good access to justice? We are not there yet, right?
Yeah.
Like, think about the average Black person being stopped on the street for a stop and search, right? Think about how many poor people cannot access the justice system. Think about like all of the imperfections in a super rich society, right? Very well educated with everything in terms of a social welfare state, perhaps that you could possibly hope for, really, right? And then think about how long rule of law has been here. Think about how devolved power is and how the fact that we all actually have like the right to vote, right? So think about all of those things that are actually working in our favor to give us good access to this one thing, right? Rule of law. And then think about these other places in the world that are struggling in a bazillion ways all at the same time. And yet we look at something like state building and say, oh, yes, if they just had rule of law, and expect countries like this to be able to do it in previously, like when we were talking about these UN missions, in maybe 2 to 5 years, right? Doesn't that sound insane to you? Like thinking about it, right? That's just completely insane. And yet, those were the kinds of expectations that we had. Maybe in a more progressive case, it would have been 10 years, right? Program that would last that long, right? All of that is out the door now, right? So I would say, the expectations for countries to just get there faster, it's hard, man. And people die for this stuff to make it stick. And even after they die, it doesn't stick. And so they wait for the next generation or 2 generations to have their go at it and to die. And hopefully, you claw a few of those rights back to the people, not back to the people, but for the people, right? So, I think about it inherently as like, okay, well, if you start with the power that is typically in a state, somebody comes in and takes power and controls that territory, it starts from the center. And then as you build out those institutions over time, what you're doing is you're devolving that power and you're just moving that power out and then trying to put it into different institutions that are controlled by people. Right. And then over time, that kind of that spreads out. And through those things, you provide services and you create an impetus. But that devolution of power, it's a fight. It's a fight between the people who have it and the people who don't. And the people who don't have to organize to, in their own ways, fight and come and take bits and slices and tiny bits and from the edges of the that power. And then over time, maybe in a place like the UK, there is less of it than used to be when there was a king, right? And then, you have the population really like gaining from those rights, but we just take those all for granted now, right?
Yeah.
And you can see what is happening in the United States where those powers are moving back in that other direction. And if people don't claim them,
how would you rank Trump's peacemaking efforts very broadly? Because he's someone who, before he was elected, he was saying that he'd sort out Ukraine in 24 hours. So now that we've seen him in action, what do you think?
And I think this is interesting because I think that he's has a Putin meeting next week. So a lot of things are happening now.
And Ukraine's not at the table.
Yeah, and then also with this Azerbaijan thing, wasn't there a thing with, was it Sudan, or Congo?
Rwanda, Congo.
Yeah,
Rwanda, Congo.
So yeah, thoughts on Trump's
How do you mark his
peacemaking?
homework?
So, I mean, Trump is such an interesting character. I think to give him some credit, I think he genuinely really does seem to want to make a dent in a lot of these conflicts. So some would say it's arguably because he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, right? That there's an end goal there, and he really wants to achieve this. I mean, whether or not you believe that, he definitely is trying to take steps to intervene and believes that because he wills it, that it will be so. To the extent that the U.S. has leverage over both sides, sometimes, bringing that leverage to bear, and this is true with any big actor, that has leverage over two sides of a conflict, right? Or a very powerful regional hegemon that says, hey, you guys fix this, right? Then that can be helpful to making the two sides come closer together. Whether or not any of these efforts actually hold is another thing. Trump is not known for having the best ability to sustain interest in a given place, right? So in a given conflict, he said that what he would do in Ukraine was solve that conflict very quickly. And it's just proven to be a lot more difficult than he thought it would be, which is, I think, no surprise to anybody, who follows the region or who does any kind of work on conflict, right? I suspect that most people in the world are not surprised that it wasn't resolved in 24 hours. But what do I think of that? I don't know what to make of that. I'm honestly much more worried about what he's doing internally within his own country. I see his efforts abroad as, go for it to the extent that you aren't doing more harm than good. And in some cases, in the case of Ukraine, it's quite difficult to read him moment to moment, because one day he'll be saying this and the next day he'll be saying exactly the opposite, right? So he sends signals in all sorts of directions. And it's not clear that, it's quite possible, he's indicated, that he could make a deal about Ukraine without Zelensky in the room, which I think the Ukrainian population will be very angry about. And again, this is not 200 years ago where you just come and settle the borders between, the United States and Russia, which is exactly what Putin wants. And who the heck believes what Putin says anyway, right? So, I mean, do you, to the extent that you can trust the other side, unless you're going to provide the security guarantee that comes with it, I think everybody will be skeptical, right? So if you are willing to put American troops on the ground to back up that guarantee, that might be another thing. But I really can't see Trump doing that, right? So if you're Zelensky, then you're watching all of this. The Europeans are watching all of this and saying, hello, you're expecting us to provide the security guarantee here. You're expecting us to, basically backstop all of this, but we don't have a seat at the table. What is going on, right? So from the European perspective, again, the same thing. So what do I think of those things? I think you're setting up a situation which is not going to work out in the end. But the one thing that Trump does have is leverage, right? He has a lot of both economic leverage and military leverage over other countries. And I mean more in the sense of his allies, in that he can say, hey, look, we provide the security umbrella for Europe. You do as we say or else. And so far, that seems to be the approach. But that only lasts as long as the other side is willing to put up with it. And as soon as it can get out of that, it will, right? So we're just entering a hugely unpredictable, we are in the middle of a hugely difficult to predict time. The UK National Security Strategy, uses the term radical uncertainty. I just think of it as, the range of options used to be, I would say, within a kind of small piece of pie range, right? So going out in a couple of different directions. And now I would say, if we started out with a range of options of what the world would look like, if you had to make predictions in the next 5 years, right? All of a sudden, those possibilities have just completely widened out, right? And I've gone from from something that is relatively narrow and relatively stable and predictable with, some outliers there, to something that is very, very difficult to predict. And AI is throwing, another layer of complexity on top of all of this. So I think it's worrying.
Yeah. Alex, did you have anything to ask or?
Well, yeah, I mean, on that last point about AI, kind of
I thought you
through
would.
through yeah. No, I mean it's true that now conflict and war is becoming. Now can you even trust what you're gonna see? The generations. You can generate anything. I could generate Putin saying whatever about Zelensky, or now you could, especially in this like Israel Palestine stuff. Both sides can generate whatever they want. Like, give it a year, no one knows what's real. That's gonna make conflict a real problem. Then on the Trump's thing, I think you're right. To give him credit, I do feel like, whatever his intentions, right? Narcissist, whatever, the efforts are there. And I was seeing this press conference like a couple of days ago that he was given on Ukraine, Russia, talking about, before his meeting with Putin. And for the first time ever, I felt like he really felt knowledgeable. He was like, because at first it's like, all right, 24 hours is going to be easy. I felt like he realized it wasn't as easy. And now he's been briefed so much on the problem because he actually wants to get it fixed. He was talking about coastline areas, the Donetsk region areas. The problem actually started in 2014. Well, 2014, but like, but it felt like, credit to him. It feels like he does want to get that problem fixed. But, so maybe we can kind of end on this, this Russia-Ukraine thing, because it feels, at least for our generation, we haven't seen the world before, and we were really born in this world of peace, and now it feels like it was this fake news world. But this fake, I say fake because it is fake, this fake idea that we now have passed this cap where now we live in a peaceful world. We've grown above all of these wars, 100 Years War, Europe fighting each other. We really thought, okay, the territories are defined and this is the world. But Russia war was really this, this fracture in the mind of our generation. It was like, well, hold on a minute. This is a real thing. And, after World War II, it really felt like we were in this new world, and there was this push of peace and rebuilding and the creation of the UN, the creation of the World Bank, and all this unified approach of world collaboration and peace. And it feels like it's been fizzling out with time. And even when we're talking about peacemaking in the UN, it also feels like the UN's power is kind of, which was created and had momentum from World War II, is now fizzling away. And so I guess I can kind of ask you how do you see, peace and conflict evolving, even though we kind of really talked about that in our whole conversation. And also, second question, is the solution to Ukraine, Russia as simple as just getting Putin and Zelensky in a room?
Yeah. I don't think it's going to be as simple as just getting the two of them in a room. They have very different views about how this should end, right? And I think there's a difficulty here too, that it's very difficult when your country is under attack to give up any part of your country, right? How do you ask a president to do that, right? I think that's a very difficult decision to have to make. Having said that, not having him in the room feels just crazy. And that it's not even that, it's that who you think of as being your closest ally undermining you in that way, I think is very problematic, right? So there's that. And I would hope that this war ends. I don't know on what terms it will. And whether or not Trump will impose his will in some way into this. But oftentimes when the settlement is too unfavorable to one side or the other, then, or perceived to be too unfavorable by one side or the other, then you'll just have instability, right? This is in some of the work that we did earlier on the project on elite bargains, we called that misalignment, right? That the power on the ground is not set at the same to really be equal to the power, to the distribution of power in the deal, right? So if the deal and what's happening on the ground are not well aligned and people feel like there's a mismatch there, you're just going to end up with another war again, right? So those kinds of things don't hold well, and it takes something else to make sure that it lasts.
Yeah.
So for that, you might get something in the short run that might not hold in the long run. And that is also that would be horrific as well, to see that war start up again. So I don't know about that. And what does peace and conflict look like in the long run? I mean, as long as there are human beings, you started with this conversation about tribes, right? And we started the conversation around cohesion and identity and what leads people to do things that you would never be able to imagine that they would be able to do, right? So, if you go back to what happened in the former Yugoslavia, these were people who were neighbors with each other. What happened in the Rwanda genocide? These were people who, married each other across across Hutus and Tutsis. And yet, people are able to do absolutely horrific things to each other. And I would say the one thing is, never imagine that it can't happen to your society, that it can't happen to our own society. Never imagine that we are not capable of doing these things ourselves, right? That there are things that make it less likely for us and reduce the incentives for us to behave like that. But if you're in Gaza and you're starving, what will you do to get food? Almost anything, right? You and your family and everybody else around you is going to die. Is that going to do great things for Israeli security in the future? I mean, basically, unless you annihilate every single Palestinian, like, all you're doing right now is storing up a huge amount of hatred. If you're just purely thinking about it from the security point of view, right? Nothing else. Just all you're doing is sowing the seeds for a new generation of never-ending terrorism by doing what you're doing. That is not going to lead to peace, right? So, I mean, how we think about these things, I would say, what has not been taken into consideration is the normal person on the ground a lot of the time. We really often think about these problems in terms of elites. And in the story, the elites are always part of the story, but there are lots of layers below that feed into the building of conflict. And you can see it in any society, right? So, you're watching this slide into authoritarianism in the United States with, most recently the troops coming in to DC, and the takeover of the DC police, right? This is basically what happened yesterday or the day before. And, these are signs that people should be very, very, very scared of. This doesn't bode well. And, that thing that I said to all of you earlier about you have to fight for it and you have to be willing to die for it. And I don't think that most of us in the West really understand what that means. We've been so lucky, so lucky since the end of the Second World War, for the most part, right? That we just don't realize how lucky we are and how hard you have to fight for your institutions to keep them viable, to keep them healthy. Yeah. I have hope in you guys.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I try to be hopeful, but I guess...
No, I think we're pretty hopeful. I think we're pretty optimistic. I think we have what we have is we cut out the fact that we look at the world because that's overwhelming. So we just try to have a very grassroots approach and, the changes we can make. And, I think we talked about this, like how, the tribal issues and how some people do things they would never expect to do because it happened to them. And it's just, I think it goes down to like, you know, it's like beware of anyone who talks about revolution, because like the first revolution starts within yourself. And I feel like maybe that's kind of an approach we take, and that somehow makes us feel like, okay, maybe we can have a difference. Because if we start just looking at these conflicts and focusing on them, it's hard to imagine how we can have an impact. And then it's easy to become lost in the chaos and the mayhem and the hopelessness and the depression and the reality of the situation on the ground. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll you know
That's
what?
a good way of putting
I
it.
think we're pretty optimistic with perspective of our generation and the reality of what's going on. But I guess let's see what happened. But Christine, thank you so much for speaking with us. That was really, I think, inspirational conversation for me.
I absolutely loved it, Christine. And to be fair, guys, I'm so sorry. Christine, I just wanted to ask you about this paper you wrote, which was How Cognitive Frames Shape the American Approach to International Relations. What does that mean?
Oh my gosh, you're going to get me to talk about one of my favorite academics. So Richard Nisbett wrote a book on the geography of thought. And for anybody who hasn't read this book, I mean, it was eye-opening for me. And I read it, maybe I want to say like 10, 15 years ago. But that work was looking from a social psychology point of view. They had people in the lab, and Richard Nisbett is a sociologist, social psychologist, sorry, at the University of Michigan, and he does a lot of experimental work in labs. And he had a grad student who was from Asia, right? So from Japan, and they were just exploring differences in how people process information and how they see the world in very, very different ways, and how their cognitive frames are actually quite different, that people have different understandings depending on the culture that they grew up in, right? So I'll just give you kind of like a classic example of the kind of two dimensions, right? And there are lots of people who do this kind of work, but I love the way that he did it and framed a lot of this work and helped our understanding of it. And he designed all of these experiments to expose all of this. So, when they were looking at the differences between, say, Japanese students and American students, right? Like two kind of very different kinds of super individualistic societies and a super collectivist one, right? At the two ends of the extreme, right? So I would say France is more on the individualistic side. I would say Nigeria, is probably a bit more on the collectivist side with kind of spikes of individualism. But, thinking about the contrast and how these societies operated, also, you could see that the way that they analyzed the world, the people from these two populations, two student populations, really processed information differently. So I'll give you one of the experiments so you can sort of understand what was going on. So they had, for example, and I do this experiment with my students just to help them understand, right, what's going on here, that they would show students a clip of an aquarium, and it had, fish in it, and then seaweed and, bubbles and all sorts of stuff, right? And they would show it to them with the fish moving around for maybe like 20 seconds. I can't remember exactly how long it was, not very long. And then they would say, draw the aquarium, right? Draw what you saw to the best of your ability. And when they analyzed what the American students drew versus what the Asian students drew, the American students got all the fish, right? Got all the big fish. And but they kind of missed out on the background details, right? Like they would miss the rocks, they would miss the seaweed, they would miss kind of the coral, they would miss the things that weren't the fish, okay? And then on the Asian side, like the Asians were much better too but they got the size of the fish right, right? So that was interesting. But the Asian students were much better at capturing all of the background and in relation to where the fish were, right? So the fish and in relation to the background and the rocks and the, whatever's along the bottom and all of this. So they got the environment much more right. right? So this was just to say, I mean, they had so many of these different kinds of experiments, but just that one experiment shows you the way in which you process information. In part was because in Japan and in Japanese society, your relationship to your environment is so important that people really think about the collective, and they think about, not just the individual and the importance of the individual, right? And in an American society, a much more individualistic society, it really is the people who count, and the relation in the kind of size of the fish, right? Like as I guess a stand-in for power or hierarchy or whatever, right? So, but it was those other things in the background just didn't
Wow.
come up as much, right? And they had so many of these kinds of really, really fascinating experiments, and you read them in their totality. And I could go on, like I have so many of these that I could name for you. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, and it totally explains me, right? Because I was brought up, my parents are from Hong Kong, so I am in many ways like, I think like an Asian, but I also think, because I was brought up in Canada, like a total individualistic Canadian, right? So, but I could see my brain oftentimes like flipping between different modes of thought. And when I read that book, I thought, oh, that totally makes sense for explaining me and my identity and who I am. But also it helped me think about international relations. It helped me think about conflict. It helped me think about why I think about the world the way that I do, in part because, I often switch between these kinds of different frames all the time, that I do this very intuitively. But he actually showed the science behind like what is going on there. And also that you're malleable, right? So I spent time as an exchange student in Japan too. And I could see a lot of the things that were described in these experiments, and why then Japanese society was so foreign to me and why it was so weird. And I understood then also like a lot of the practices and just things that had happened earlier. I was like, oh, this makes so much sense now that I understand. Oh, actually, it's a whole way of like organizing your brain, but the way in which you frame things is also reinforced by the environment around you. And so when you change your environment, then your frames change, right? That made so much sense to me,
Wow.
right? So, I mean, absolutely, I would say mind-blowing in terms of like power of the revelation there.
Oh, wow. So I guess for us, we have this dichotomy of the individualist mindset and the collectivist mindset. But someone who is very English, if they were put in a more collectivist environment, would they also be more collectivist? Like if they were in China or Nigeria, would they also start to, change?
So are you bringing some over as a kid, or are you bringing them over as like
As an adult?
As an adult, and at what age, and like to what extent,
Okay.
to what extent
Too
is that
many
person
factors.
kind of like
Okay.
malleable to the environment? I mean, these are generalizations, right? You're always going to have people who are very individualistic within a collectivist society and very collectivist within an individualistic society, right? So we're just talking about like broad norms, broad averages here. But the fact that you can see these effects is very interesting, right? And things like religion will shape all of that, gender norms will shape all of that. There are lots of things that go into the making of this. But you can see it in all sorts of things, both like in the way in which people analyze problems, the ways that people explain things, the extent to which people would, if there's a particular situation and everything goes wrong, right? Do you blame it on the individual or do you blame it on the environment, right? And I would say largely in individualistic societies, you blame it on the individual and you really underestimate the power of all of the environmental factors. Whereas if you're, and they've shown this actually again with another one of these experiments, right? They were looking to ask somebody, they asked people, hey, like there was a mass shooting that happened in a university lab. And one of the experiments was to ask people from the kind of, Asian side and the American side, what would you say, led up to the person doing this? And the people on the, American side would list like maybe 10 factors or something, or 5 factors, whatever it was, some small number of things. And the people on the other side, on the Asian side, would list like 100 things.
So
Right?
fascinating.
Like, and they had read the same kind of like, um, the prep work for understanding the case and how it was described. They had the same material, and they, this was a case that was in the news. But they thought about it really quite differently and processed the event quite differently. I hope I'm not mangling any of these experiments, but I mean, there are so many of them that are like this. And I just generally love social psychology and using it to explain like why my brain works the way that it does, but also why somebody else's brain works very differently. And then if you understand that too, I think, again, this is another piece of the empathy, right? It is that you have really different values than I do because you sit within the social construction of, your society and your place within that society. And there are things that you are allowed to do, and there are things that you see that are important or not important. And I might see exactly the opposite, right? And so we make decisions like that. And I think a lot of the time we impose what we think are our values and transpose them onto somebody else. And they're just not right.
And I think another interesting point is that there's no right or wrong either. And in a lot of African languages, they don't have the word privacy. And so a lot of scholars have alluded to the fact that, privacy is an alien concept. And we have this capitalist system which is rooted in private property. And perhaps there is some issues with them getting to terms of the capitalism. Like, it's going to take some time because this is a very alien way of organizing a society and production. And this sort of feeds into this idea of, different people have different frameworks for thinking about these things. And it's very important to factor into the discussion. And it can help us bridge us together or, have more empathy. So I just loved what you just said. The fish example is bonkers. Like, that's even down to the size. Like, the size is insane. It's fascinating.
How we view things.
Yeah.
But I think even like, taking that, zooming out to even looking at like the conflict with kind of the West or America and China, completely, two different individuals and really communal societies. Even I would say like the way they see things, but yeah, I think it also even affects maybe their goals. Like maybe what America wants and what they think is so great is maybe not what China wants and what they think is so great, and vice versa. And like, as you said, maybe there's not a right and wrong, but we just have to understand that, all right, we're different and we want different things, but we can coexist in that way.
That's kind of why we wrote that piece, because I thought, in the thinking about the cognitive frames, it is that you tend to think about the world and you make assumptions about the world and the way that it works based on, everything in relation to your world and in relation to the institutions and the knowledge and, your values. And you assume that everybody else has those, right? But in American international relations in particular, there are certain things that are seen as, hey, like, this is how it works, right? And that is actually not true for a large part of the world, right? That those are actually really deeply problematic assumptions. And if you can't, but it's hard to remove yourself from that unless you either come from a different culture and you have an understanding, oh, actually, like, there's this whole other way of organizing things, right? Like with, as you said, this idea of privacy, right? That just, I can totally understand why that word would not exist in African societies, right? Like that just, it makes sense to me intuitively, having spent time, a lot of time in Africa.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about, but it completely makes sense to me. And there are lots of things like that, that one in particular, though, makes it very difficult to institute property rights, and then makes it difficult for foreign investment to come if you feel like you can't have ownership. If you don't understand this idea of ownership and where ownership sits, then the whole thing feels like it's very much sitting on, it's like quicksand, right? It could vanish at any time, or you don't really know what you're stepping on. It's very unstable. who wants to invest in that kind of environment? But in order then to bring in the investment, you have to bring in this very alien concept, which people don't like, right? And which comes with a whole set of other problems and new institutions that people don't understand and don't trust, right? So, how do you bridge these things? Honestly, I don't know, but I think for people who are not coming from, who don't have, I guess, insight into those other ways of how societies organize themselves, they just think, oh, like, why don't they just do it like us? Or they assume that everybody, should and ought to do it like us. And that's often a lot of the source of tension.
And also, I think in the attempt to try and change, people might not realize how alien it actually is. So with the privacy example, like growing up, my mum could just walk into my room at any time. I didn't even think there was anything wrong with it, But, I grew up with a lot of British people who were white, and, their parents would have to like knock on the door and like wait for their permission to go into the room. So when I observed this growing up, I thought that's so strange, So if this is a fundamental way of life for these people, and even me, who's lived in London my whole life, it's very alien, I think, if I were to sort of have this this privacy in my life, because we're such a communal family and society, and it's so embedded in so many aspects of our lives that you just might not realize. And if I were to have children, I would also have the lines blurred. Like I wouldn't let my child, I don't need my child's permission to go into their room, because we're family, we are this one entity, we're a unit. And I would also raise my children in that fashion. So it's so ingrained, even if someone like me who's so far removed from that, I still have these ideals, like they're so embedded into us. And I think it's important to acknowledge, how fundamental they are to that society, So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this is also, I know you guys do development economics, right? So
Yeah.
some of the most fascinating work I find is coming from that kind of development economics / historical economic stuff, where you see effects on things like corruption, carried on down like multiple generations, right? If you look, so there's work done looking at why rates of or norms of generalized trust are highest in the United States in the areas that were settled by folks from the northern Scandinavian countries, right? So in the Midwest, like around, because they were settled from people around like
Grimsby
Sweden.
and-
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that area actually, like around Minnesota and so forth, like that. That just has very high levels of generalized trust because of the generational effects. And you see all of this kind of stuff, that the role of culture can be incredibly powerful, right? And it can persist despite all of these other differences within the country. And I can see something like that. That's why I said to you, within a country, you may be British, but there will often be exceptions to that rule. And this would be a
Yeah.
reason for one of those exceptions, right? So I completely get where you're coming from, because I also, was brought up in a Hong Kong Chinese household in a very, relatively individualistic society. And there are things that I bring with me because of that upbringing. But also like things that have changed over time too, right? So you kind of see that, your environment always influences you. And you move to a new environment, you can become somebody quite different.
And I guess culture is also very dynamic and fluid. So perhaps one day Nigeria might lose this, or Africa very generally might lose this idea of like a lack of privacy. Perhaps, perhaps we might become private people, There's
or
no
vice
telling.
versa with Europe.
Yeah, they
Who
could
knows?
become more communal.
Could be. I mean, I saw some of this happening in Liberia, like when I was when I was visiting, when I first did my field work in 2005 and 7. You'd sit in the back of a local taxi and everybody was talking to each other, right? They didn't care where you were from. And now, the last time I went in 2018, when I went to give my book talks, it was completely different. People did not talk to each other at all. Everybody sat on their phone
Wow.
silently. And we all shared this same very cramped, intimate space together, right? Like everybody's sweating on top of everybody else. But they weren't talking to each other at all. And I just found that really weird, right? I found that the fact that it had become a more peaceful place, but in many ways, like a less cohesive place, like in that sort of very social space that used to be, whatever the public square was, right? Really, like inside these taxis, that had completely changed. So, I think like technology is changing us, like the things that are happening in the environment are changing us. Your politics changes you, right? It makes it more difficult sometimes for you to say things that will change you. Fear changes you. So yeah, anything is possible.
I like the fact that we were able to do a full circle and start on identity and come back.
Yeah.
And like a really full circle moment. But Christine, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
An absolute privilege and pleasure.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah. Nice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was really fun.